Nobody in Harlan County could explain why Samuel Harrington rode into Milford on a borrowed horse with a single saddlebag and boots that had seen better years. He asked no questions about land prices. He introduced himself to nobody. He took a room above the feed store for 50 cents a week and ate his supper at the counter of whatever establishment was still lit when the sun quit the sky. The people of Milford watched him the way small towns always watch a stranger, quietly, from the corners of their eyes, drawing conclusions without the inconvenience of conversation. What none of them knew was that Samuel Harrington owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. He had a house with glass windows and a barn that could shelter 80 head in a storm. He had men who worked for him, land that produced, and a name that carried weight in every bank from Milford to the territory line. And he had chosen, deliberately and without apology, to leave all of it behind for a season. The reason was simple, even if it wasn't easy to admit. The last woman who had come calling on Samuel Harrington had arrived with her father, a ledger, and a list of questions about acreage. He had listened politely. He had answered her questions. And when she'd smiled at him over the table, he had understood, with a clarity that settled cold in his chest, that she was not smiling at him at all. That had been 8 months ago. He had not courted anyone since. Milford was the kind of town that existed mostly out of stubbornness. A main street, a church, a livery, a general store run by a man named Dobbs, who remembered every face and forgot nothing. There was a schoolhouse on the eastern edge of town, and beside it, a small house with a vegetable garden that someone tended with obvious care. Samuel noticed the garden on his 3rd morning, not because it was remarkable, it wasn't, but because the woman working in it did not look up when he rode past. Every other soul in Milford had found some reason to observe him openly by his 2nd day. This woman had her back to the road and was pulling weeds with the focused attention of someone who had decided the world beyond her fence was not presently her concern. He did not think much of it then. He thought about it the following morning when the same thing happened again. Her name, he learned from Dobbs 3 days later while purchasing a bag of dried beans, was Violet Hawthorne. She taught at the schoolhouse. She had come to Milford 2 years prior with her father, who had since passed, and she had stayed on because the town needed a teacher, and, as Dobbs put it with a shrug, she had not seen fit to go anywhere else. "Quiet girl," Dobbs added, not as a criticism. Samuel took his beans and said nothing. That evening he sat on the narrow step outside his rented room and watched the last of the daylight leave the hills. He was not thinking about Violet Hawthorne. He was thinking about the fact that he had now been in Milford for 11 days and had not yet felt the particular discomfort that had driven him to leave his own land. No one had asked him about cattle. No one had asked him about money. A man named Earl, who drank at the saloon on Tuesday nights, had asked him if he played cards, and when Samuel said he didn't, Earl had said that was probably sensible and offered him a biscuit. For the first time in longer than he could account for, Samuel felt something loosen in his chest. He didn't examine the feeling too closely. He simply sat with it until the stars came out, then went inside to sleep. The first time he spoke to Violet Hawthorne was an accident, or close enough to one that Samuel allowed himself to call it that. He had been asked by the livery owner, a wide man named Pearson, to haul a load of fence posts to the east end of town. Samuel had agreed because he had nothing better to do that morning, and because working with his hands had always quieted something in him that thinking could not. He was stacking the last of the posts when one of the older children from the schoolhouse came sprinting around the corner and ran directly into his legs. The boy sat down hard in the dirt, looked up with startled eyes. and then burst into the kind of tears that are less about pain and more about surprise. Before Samuel could do anything useful, the schoolhouse door opened. Violet Hawthorne crossed the yard with the unhurried stride of someone who had handled worse. She crouched beside the boy, checked his knees, said something low and even that Samuel couldn't hear. The boy's tears stopped almost immediately. She helped him up, dusted his trousers, and sent him back inside with a small push between the shoulder blades. Then she straightened and looked at Samuel. "He runs everywhere," she said. "I apologize on his behalf." "No need," Samuel said. She studied him for a moment, not with the measuring look he had grown accustomed to, that particular inventory of a man's boots, his horse, the wear on his jacket, but with something more neutral, more careful, as if she was deciding something that had nothing to do with what he owned. "You're the man renting the room above the feed store," she said. "Samuel Harrington." Violet Hawthorne. She did not offer her hand, but her nod was direct. "Are those posts for the Pearson fence?" "They are. He's been needing to fix that section for 2 seasons, she said. "I'm glad someone finally got to it." She went back inside. Samuel stood in the yard a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he picked up his work gloves from the post pile and walked back to the livery. He returned the following afternoon, though he had no reason to. The children were in their noon recess, running the yard in the uncoordinated way of children who have been sitting still too long. Violet was at the fence with a cup of something hot, watching them with the contained patience of a woman who knew exactly how many minutes of quiet she had left. Samuel had told himself he was walking that direction to check on the posts. The posts did not need checking. He stopped at the fence a few feet from her. She glanced over without surprise. "They're loud today," he offered. "They're always loud," she said. "I've learned to consider it a sign of health." He found, to his own mild surprise, that he had nothing calculated to say to that, nothing designed to impress or deflect. He simply stood beside her at the fence and watched the children chase each other in the dust, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. After a while, she said, without looking at him, "What brought you to Milford, Mr. Harrington?" It was the question he had been waiting for, the one everyone in town had been too polite or too indirect to ask plainly. He had prepared 3 different versions of an answer. None of them felt adequate now. "I needed to be somewhere I wasn't known," he said. She considered that, took a sip from her cup. "That's an honest answer," she said. "Did you expect otherwise?" She looked at him then, and there was something in her expression he couldn't quite read, something careful and watchful and not unkind. "I don't usually expect anything," she said. "It keeps things simpler." The bell above the schoolhouse door rang. She set down her cup on the fence post, straightened her collar, and walked back to meet her students. Samuel watched her go. He stood there long enough that Pearson, passing on a wagon on the far end of the road, called out something that Samuel didn't hear. He lifted a hand in response and turned back toward town. The feeling in his chest was not the loosening from before. It was something else. Something he did not have an immediate name for. He thought about it the rest of the afternoon and most of the evening, and when he finally slept, it was later than usual. The trouble with Milford was that it was a small town, and small towns had long memories and short distances between one end and the other. By the 3rd week of Samuel's stay, the general understanding among the townspeople was that he was a drifter of some modest means, honest enough, useful with his hands, and apparently taken with standing near the schoolhouse fence more often than any fence post repair could justify. Dobbs had mentioned it to Pearson. Pearson had mentioned it to Earl. Earl, who had the social discretion of a rooster, had mentioned it to 3 other men before noon on a Wednesday. Nobody said anything to Samuel directly, but the looks had changed. They were warmer now, and faintly amused, the way people look at something they've decided is their business whether or not they've been invited. Samuel noticed. He said nothing. What he hadn't anticipated was that Violet would notice too. She didn't bring it up at the fence, or in the brief exchanges they had fallen into. A word in the morning when he passed, a short conversation in the afternoon if the children were occupied. She simply appeared one Thursday at the door of the feed store while he was helping stack grain sacks for Dobbs and asked if he had any interest in earning a meal. He looked at her. "The roof above my back room has been leaking since February," she said. "I can pay in food. I cook adequately." "I've been told worse offers," Samuel said. "Then come Saturday morning," she said. "Early." She left before Dobbs could arrange his expression into anything less than delighted. The house was modest. 2 rooms, a kitchen, the garden he had noticed from the road. Inside it was clean and ordered in the way of someone who had learned to manage space carefully. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. A small shelf of books beside the window, a table with 2 chairs. A lamp that had been repaired at the base with a strip of tin, neatly done. Samuel looked at the lamp and said nothing. But he noticed. The roof repair took most of the morning. It was not a complicated job, just one that required patience and someone willing to climb. He worked without hurrying. Violet brought him water twice without being asked, and both times left it on the ladder rung and went back to whatever she was doing without making conversation out of it. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. By noon, the leak was sealed, and he had come down off the roof and was washing his hands at the pump when she called him inside. She had made biscuits and a pot of stew that had been on the fire long enough to mean she had started it before he arrived. There was coffee. She set it all on the table without ceremony and sat across from him, and they ate in the easy quiet of 2 people who had discovered, without quite deciding to, that they were comfortable in each other's silence. "You do good work," she said eventually. "It wasn't difficult." "Most people don't do things just because they aren't difficult," she said. He looked up. She was not looking at him. She was breaking a biscuit with the focused attention she gave most things. But there was something deliberate in the observation, the way she sometimes said things that were slightly more than what they appeared to be on the surface. "You've been here 2 years," he said. "I have." "And before Milford?" She was quiet for a moment. "My father moved us often. He was a man of optimistic plans." Something passed across her face, brief and old. "Milford was where the plans ran out. We'd intended to move on in the spring, but the spring didn't cooperate with us. And you stayed. The children needed a teacher, and she paused, set down her biscuit. "I found that I liked having one place, one fence, one garden I'd planted myself." She said it simply, without sentimentality. "It sounds small, I suppose." "It doesn't," Samuel said. She looked at him then, the same careful look from the schoolyard, but something in it had shifted incrementally, the way a door moves when the latch gives. "What do you do, Mr. Harrington? When you're somewhere, you're known." The question arrived gently, not prying, just honest, the way she tended to be. He felt the familiar weight of it, the moment where the answer would either be the truth or a version of it. He had maintained the version for 3 weeks without difficulty. Sitting at this particular table, with this particular cup of coffee and this particular woman looking at him, without wanting anything he could see, he found the version harder to locate than usual. "I manage land," he said. Which was true. which was also the thinnest possible edge of the truth. She nodded, as if that were enough, and did not ask for more. It was, he thought, the single most disarming thing she could have done. He fixed her fence the following Saturday. The week after that, she asked him to look at the schoolhouse window that had swollen in the frame and wouldn't close properly. He looked at it. He planed it down. She made coffee. It became, without either of them naming it, a pattern. The town watched with undisguised interest. Earl made a comment at the saloon that Samuel chose to let pass. Dobbs began setting aside the better cuts of jerky when Samuel came in, for no reason either of them acknowledged. Even Pearson, who was not a sentimental man, had started nodding at Samuel with the particular approval of someone who has decided a situation is proceeding correctly. Samuel let them watch. He had nothing to hide, nothing they could see, at any rate. The complication arrived on a Wednesday in the form of a man named George Westland. Westland rode in on a good horse and stopped at Dobbs' store first, the way people did when they wanted information. He was well dressed in the way that announced itself, coat cut from decent cloth, boots without a scuff of honest work on them. He asked Dobbs questions that Dobbs answered with the careful economy of a man measuring how much he wanted to contribute. Samuel was at the livery when Westland came looking for him. He recognized the type immediately. He had employed 3 men like Westland over the years, men sent to locate, to assess, to relay. The recognition landed in his stomach before Westland said a single word. "Mr. Harrington." Westland extended his hand. "Thought I'd have a harder time finding you." "What do you want, George?" Westland smiled with the patience of someone being paid to be patient. "Your foreman's asking about the Eastern Boundary Survey. 2 weeks now with no word. And the banker in Crestfield wants signatures on the pasture lease before end of month." He paused. "The men are managing fine, but your signature isn't something I can forge on your behalf." "I'm aware. Are you coming back then?" Samuel looked at the man. Down the street, the schoolhouse sat in the late afternoon light, quiet, the children long since sent home. The small house beside it had smoke coming from the chimney. Someone was cooking supper. "Not yet," Samuel said. Westland absorbed this. "How much longer?" "I don't know. Mr. Harrington, tell Hutchins the Eastern Boundary can wait until I return. Tell the bank the same." Samuel handed the man a folded paper from his jacket. He had written it 2 days ago, some part of him having known this moment was coming. "Signatures on everything urgent. I'll be back when I'm back." Westland took the paper with the expression of a man who had been asked to explain things he did not fully understand. "Is there something keeping you here?" Samuel looked down the road once more. "Yes," he said. The problem was that Westland had not been quiet about it. He had not been indiscreet, not deliberately, but a well-dressed man asking after another man by name in a town the size of Milford left residue. By Thursday morning, 2 people had mentioned to 2 other people that someone had come looking for the man renting the feed store room, that the visitor had called him Mr. Harrington in the way people use a name when it carries something behind it. Samuel heard none of this directly. He heard it in the slight change of Dobbs' expression when he came in for tobacco. He heard it in the way Earl greeted him at the saloon, with a look that was almost a question. He heard it most clearly on Friday afternoon when he went to the schoolhouse fence and Violet was already there, cup in hand. But her posture was different. Not closed, not cold, but measured in a way it hadn't been before. "Someone came looking for you," she said. Not an accusation, a fact. "He works for me," Samuel said. She turned to look at him. "Works for you?" "Yes." She was quiet. A child shouted something on the far side of the yard. The smoke from 2 chimneys along the main road drifted east. "You said you manage land," she said. "I do." "How much land, Mr. Harrington?" He held her gaze. "More than a man renting a room above a feed store would typically be associated with." She absorbed that. Her expression did not shift dramatically. That was somehow worse than if it had. A small stillness, a slight recalibration behind her eyes. "Why?" she asked. Just that. Not angry. Just wanting to understand. "Because I needed to know," he said. "What it was like to be in a place where nobody knew what I owned." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light sat between them, warm and unhurried, and the children's voices carried on in the yard behind her, and Samuel stood at the fence with the full weight of the thing he had kept from her sitting plainly in the open air between them. She turned back toward the yard. "I need to bring them in," she said. Her voice was even. "It's getting cold." She rang the bell and waited for the children to come in, and walked inside behind them, without looking back at him. Samuel stood at the fence until the door closed. Then he stood there a little longer. The feeling in his chest was no longer something he lacked a name for. He knew exactly what it was now. And he knew, with equal clarity, that he may have just ruined it. Samuel did not go to the schoolhouse fence on Saturday. He told himself it was because she needed time. That was true enough. But it was also true that he had sat on the narrow step outside his room until well past midnight, listening to the town settle into quiet, and had found no version of the next conversation that didn't require him to say something he had not yet figured out how to say. He fixed a broken wagon wheel for Pearson instead. He worked slowly and without his usual focus, and Pearson, who was not a perceptive man in most respects, watched him for a while, and then went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee and handed one over without comment. Samuel drank it and said nothing, and Pearson let him, which was its own kind of kindness. Sunday came and went. Monday morning he was at the pump behind the feed store when he heard the schoolhouse bell ring, the ordinary opening bell, the one that meant the day was beginning and the children were filing in, and Violet Hawthorne was standing at the front of a room doing what she had chosen to do with her life in the town she had decided to stay in. He pumped the water. He washed his face. He went upstairs and sat on the edge of his cot and looked at the wall. The honest accounting of it was this: he had come to Milford under false pretenses. Not false in any malicious sense. He had not lied to her, not directly, but false in the way that withholding a significant truth is always a kind of lie when the person across from you is being entirely genuine. And Violet Hawthorne had been genuine from the first morning she'd looked at him across that fence without trying to determine what he was worth. That was the thing that sat in him like a stone. She had given him exactly what he had come looking for: simple, unadorned regard, and he had accepted it, while keeping the thing that would have changed, it locked in his jacket pocket like a document awaiting signature. He owed her better than that. He went to the schoolhouse at noon when the children were at their recess. She was not at the fence. She was inside, visible through the window, writing something on the board. He waited. After a few minutes, she came to the door to call the children in and saw him standing in the yard. She did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been expecting something and was not yet sure what she intended to do about it. "Can I speak with you?" he said. She considered him for a moment. Then she said something to the children that sent them inside ahead of her, and she stepped down into the yard and pulled the door partially closed behind her. The afternoon was cool and still. A magpie landed on the fence post and left again. "I should have told you sooner," Samuel said. That's the beginning and the end of it. There isn't a justification I can offer that makes it less than what it was." She crossed her arms, not defensively, he thought, but in the way of someone who is listening carefully and wants to be still while they do it. "I came here because the last woman who called on me arrived with a ledger," he said. "I don't say that to make myself into something pathetic. I say it because it's the reason. I wanted to be somewhere nobody knew the ledger existed. I wanted—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to know what it was like to be seen without it." She was quiet. "And then I met you," he said. "And you looked at me like I was just a man at a fence post. And I didn't want to disturb that. I kept waiting for a moment that felt right to tell you, and I let too many moments pass. And then Westland arrived and took the choice away from me." The magpie returned to the fence post. Neither of them looked at it. "What is your name?" she said. "Your real name, the one the banker knows." "Samuel Harrington," he said. "That part was always true. And the rest. I own the Harrington operation outside Crestfield. 1,200 acres. Cattle, mostly. A house that has more rooms than one man has any use for." He said it plainly, without apology and without pride. "I am not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you were actually talking to at your fence all these weeks." Violet looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that is doing real work behind the eyes. "I knew something was off," she said finally. He blinked. "You knew." "Not the particulars. But a man with nothing doesn't hold himself the way you do. It isn't arrogance. It's just a kind of steadiness that comes from not worrying about where the next meal is." She paused. "I decided it wasn't my business until it became my business." Samuel stared at her. "And now?" "Now it is my business," she said. "Because you came back to tell me. You didn't have to. You could have settled Westland's paperwork and ridden back to Crestfield, and that would have been the end of it. That was never an option I was considering." She looked at him carefully. "What option were you considering?" He held her gaze. "Whatever you'd allow me to consider." She was quiet long enough that the children's voices from inside the schoolhouse rose and fell and rose again. The magpie decided the fence post wasn't worth the trouble and left for good. "You should know," Violet said slowly, "that I am not a woman who is moved by 1,200 acres. "I know that," Samuel said. "It's the reason I'm standing here." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a loosening, a small surrender of the careful distance she had maintained since Friday. She looked at him the way she had that first afternoon at the table, when she'd asked what kept him in Milford, and he'd answered honestly. And something in her had decided he was worth another conversation. "Come to supper," she said. "Tonight. And tell me something true that has nothing to do with land or cattle or ledgers." "I can do that," Samuel said. "I expect you can," she said. And for the first time since Wednesday, the corner of her mouth moved in the direction of something that was almost a smile. She went back inside. Samuel stood in the empty yard and exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding a breath since Friday afternoon, without realizing it. He came to supper that evening with nothing but himself, which was, he was beginning to understand, the only thing she had ever wanted him to bring. They sat at the small table with its 2 chairs, and she had made something simple and good, and he told her about the first time he'd tried to build a fence alone at 17, and had done it so badly that his father had laughed until he had to sit down. She told him about the winter her father's plan had involved a river crossing in late November and a wagon that had not been equal to the current, and how they had arrived in the next town with nothing dry and everything they owned smelling of river water for 3 months. They laughed at the same moments. They were quiet at the same moments. He told her, somewhere in the middle of the second cup of coffee, that the house in Crestfield had a window on the east side that caught the morning light in a way that made the whole kitchen glow, and that it had always seemed like something that deserved more than one person looking at it. Violet turned her cup in her hands and said nothing. But she did not look away. That was October. By December, Samuel had stopped renting the room above the feed store. He was making the ride between Milford and Crestfield twice a week, which Pearson pointed out was an inefficient arrangement, and Dobbs agreed with by saying nothing and continuing to set aside the better jerky. He asked her in January. They were standing in her garden in the cold, looking at the frozen ground, talking about what she intended to plant in the spring. She said yes before he had entirely finished asking, which she later claimed was because she had already decided in October and had simply been waiting for him to arrive at the same conclusion. He did not argue the point. They married in March in the Milford church, which was small and cold and entirely full. Earl cried, which surprised everyone, including Earl. Dobbs brought a jar of preserves as a gift and seemed to feel this was appropriate. Pearson shook Samuel's hand for longer than was strictly necessary. Violet wore a dress the color of winter grass and carried nothing except herself, which had always been, Samuel thought, the entirety of what she possessed and the whole of what she offered, and more than enough. They kept the Milford house. Violet finished the school year and handed the classroom to a young woman from the next county who needed the position and had the temperament for it. In the fall, they were in Crestfield, in the house with the east-facing window, and in the mornings, the kitchen filled with light the way Samuel had described. And more often than not, Violet was the first one standing in it, cup in hand, looking at the hills the way she had always looked at things, carefully, without hurry, as if the seeing itself was enough. 2 years later, there was a boy they named Thomas, who ran everywhere and broke things with cheerful consistency and had his mother's calm eyes and his father's unfortunate stubbornness. A year after Thomas came a girl they named June, who was quieter than her brother and observed the world from a composed distance that made Samuel feel, with a frequency that never entirely went away, that he was being gently assessed by someone far wiser than her years. On a Thursday evening when June was 3 and Thomas was 4, and both of them were finally mercifully asleep, Samuel and Violet sat on the porch of the Crestfield house and listened to the night come in across the land. "Do you ever regret it?" Violet asked. "Coming to Milford the way you did?" Samuel thought about the borrowed horse, the 50-cent room, the boots he had worn specifically because they looked like they'd been through more than they had. "I regret the weeks I wasted at that fence not telling you the truth," he said. "You told it eventually. Later than I should have." She was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said, "that if you had ridden in on a good horse and introduced yourself properly on the first day, I would have been polite and entirely uninterested." He looked at her. "A man who comes in quietly and fixes fence posts and has nothing to prove," she said. "That is a different proposition. Even if it was a construction. It wasn't entirely," she said. "That part of you was real. You just also happened to own 1,200 acres. Samuel looked out at the dark land beyond the porch. His land. Their land now, in the way that things become shared without a document being required. 1,400, he said. "We bought the Henderson parcel in spring." Violet made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but close enough. 1,400 acres, she said. "And you came to Milford on a borrowed horse." It seemed like the honest approach at the time. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the easy, unthinking way of two people who have become part of each other's ordinary. The night settled around them. Somewhere across the property, a calf called once and was quiet. "It was," she said. "Eventually,